Yeah, welcome to today's meetup of our PowerShell user group Rhein-Neckar. I think it's the third session this year. Am I right? I think so. I should look at the next slide because there it says yes, it's the third one. And we have Aleksandar Nikolić with us, Microsoft MVP, Azure Advisor, well-known trainer, speaker, overall great guy, well-known in the community. And as we said in the beginning, involved in this Entra PowerShell module very, very early. So I would say, Aleksandar, you're really the expert. So welcome, Aleksandar.
I'm just more informed than some other people, that's all.
That's a nice way to put it. So before we go into Aleksandar's session, so we will, as usual, do a little introduction. So Ryan, you want to say a few words?
Yeah, sure. So those of you that have been in here before, you've seen me before. I also noticed my picture's a little out of date. I've got a little less hair on my face now. But my name's Ryan. I work as a cloud architect at Lukanya AG. And right now my main focus is on Microsoft 365 environments. But I will also soon start focusing more on Azure. So you'll probably see some different topics from me coming in the coming months.
Awesome. Yeah, my name is Heiko. I'm working for ScriptRunner, who's also kind of sponsoring this meetup here. And I'm actually officially head of marketing, but I would say I'm kind of technical, but well, that's not my role here. So my role and our role is to get people to talk about PowerShell, to do something for the community. And by the way, if you want to follow us, of course, you can find us on LinkedIn and Twitter. You can find the recordings of previous sessions on our YouTube channel. I will put in the links also later on. We have a Twitter account. You can find us on LinkedIn. And we are on Meetup. And for Meetup, I think we have something to celebrate because since today, or actually yesterday, we have 300 members now on Meetup. That's really great. So thanks for following us. So it looks like there is some interest.
332 now.
All right. And counting. That's really cool. So thanks. And of course, we're going to continue to do this sessions. So we're still looking into doing it hybrid, maybe in a couple of months if we get some good opportunities. We'll see. And yes, so ScriptRunner is sponsoring the meetup. We're paying for the meetup costs and stuff like that. And if you want to have some PowerShell free resources, feel free to go to our website. We have PowerShell poster, PowerShell security ebook, PowerShell cheat sheet for Teams Exchange, and even AD now. And there will be one for Microsoft Graph as well in the near future. So feel free to go there. And last thing, before we actually dive into the actual content, another hint, so to speak, there will be a PowerShell Saturday in Karlsruhe, actually in the ScriptRunner building, which is nearby Karlsruhe. So if you're in the area, feel free to come by. It's an in-person event. The event language will be English. It will be hosted in our office. It's free, but we will have some pizza for lunch. So we have some really well-known speakers from Sweden, from I think Bulgaria, and from the Netherlands. And so I think it's going to be a full day of great PowerShell content as well. So if you are around, feel free. And I'll also post in the links later in the chat as well. So with this, quick look at the agenda, pretty easy. So now it's time, to hear about Entra PowerShell versus Graph PowerShell. So again, Aleksandar, thanks a lot for taking the time, and looking forward to what you can tell us about the good new Entra PowerShell module.
Okay, so should I share?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Okay. You can see my slide?
Yes.
Excellent.
Slide?
Looks good.
Okay, it looks good. So welcome to Entra PowerShell versus Graph PowerShell. The official names for those modules are Microsoft Entra PowerShell and Microsoft Graph PowerShell. But it's kind of too long to say it all the time, so I will just use Entra PowerShell and Graph PowerShell. It's just easier. As Heiko already told you in the beginning, I'm a Microsoft MVP and also PowerShell and Azure trainer. I'm part of the PowerShell community for quite a long time. And I got involved in development of Entra PowerShell since the early days when it was still not even in a private preview. And it's interesting how things are progressing with it. And I would like to show you certain things that they are doing correctly and certain things that I think they should do better, and compare the Entra PowerShell, Entra and Graph PowerShell, and see how things are going there. So from official documentation that they have that they used for announcing Entra PowerShell in June, I pick a couple of things for intro slides, and I have only 3 slides, and then we will move to demos because I don't want to bore you with lots of slides. Entra PowerShell is created with the main goal to kind of make it easier for people to migrate from AzureAD module that is now deprecated and will be retired next March. And that's the kind of a short-term goal. In the long term, you can imagine that they want to make the best possible module for managing Entra resources with PowerShell. Okay, so right now, focus is on kind of a compatibility with the AzureAD, but then through the development of it, they realized that they also need to provide certain compatibility with the Microsoft Graph as well. So one of the examples is like aliases for parameters and aliases for commands. Those kind of things should be also easier to follow if you already started with Microsoft Graph PowerShell, but you want to continue with Entra PowerShell to manage Entra resources. It's also important to understand it, to keep in mind that Entra PowerShell is still in preview, right? So the breaking changes are happening. Redesigns are happening as well. They're kind of changing the way how they are doing certain things behind the scenes. And that's completely normal because it's preview, right? So it's expected for them to introduce breaking changes between releases. The Entra PowerShell doesn't compete with Microsoft Graph PowerShell, right? They should work well together. When I say that, you need to kind of keep in mind that Entra PowerShell is dependent on Entra-related Microsoft Graph modules, and they're dependent on a certain version of it. So you might experience the problems if you have a newer version of Microsoft Graph PowerShell and then Entra PowerShell on the same machine, and then you will not have a DLL hell, but you will have a kind of a assembly hell, and you will have a problem with that. So that's one of the things that you need to keep in mind. It's nice when they say they work very well together, but if they are not with compatible versions, then you might experience some issues, right? And I hope that they will fix some of those or provide better error message by the GA, because right now I see that a couple of people that are already using Entra PowerShell are confused when certain things are not working properly for them. Okay. Development of Entra PowerShell should also help to improve Graph PowerShell in a way that if they, together with users, realize that there are certain bugs that should be fixed, those things should be fixed, sometimes at the Microsoft Graph PowerShell level, sometimes even at the API level, right? Entra PowerShell also keeps all the benefits of Microsoft Graph PowerShell in a way that, for example, they are reusing the module, the commandlet for doing the authentication to Microsoft Graph APIs. They are not creating something totally new. They are kind of reusing the error handling and that the low-level API coverage. So all the things that are kind of good in Microsoft Graph PowerShell SDK, the Entra PowerShell will reuse them. And I already mentioned that they are providing with Entra significant compatibility with Azure AD and MSOL modules. So for example, the parameters for referencing the Azure AD objects is object ID, when in Microsoft Graph, you have specific ones, user ID for users, group ID for groups, and Entra PowerShell started with the object ID, but then the people that tried it said, like, why you are not introducing aliases so that object ID will be alias for all those specific ones. So if people are coming from Azure AD to use Entra, it will work for them. If they're coming from Microsoft Graph PowerShell to work with Entra, it will work for them as well, right? So they are now in the process of that. I think that maybe with the next release, they will completely introduce all the needed aliases so that people don't worry about those things anymore. When to use which of those PowerShell modules? And for Graph PowerShell, the use case is kind of a low-level thing. Wrappers for the API provide you flexibility. Entra PowerShell should provide more of a scenario-based commands. So not just blindly following the API and wrapping things around it to give you just PowerShell experience, but also allow you to perform certain scenario-based actions when you will not just think about the API and API capabilities, but you will go beyond that. Usability of Graph PowerShell is, as they say, more for developers, developer-focused, which means that if you are a power user, and we see that more and more, is that the developers are kind of not having as much problems with the Graph PowerShell as the pure admins have, because they are kind of familiar with working with the APIs, and when the things are not working as they should, then they are going with the direct REST API calls, targeting Microsoft Graph APIs. And those are the things that the IT pros, the admins, should not be worried so much and be focused so much on that. And Entra should kind of fill in the gap there. All right, so that's kind of a plan and a vision for Entra PowerShell. Microsoft Graph PowerShell should always be current in a way that every month we have a new release that is following all the changes in the API. Entra PowerShell should kind of follow the Microsoft Graph releases, but I think it will be always a little bit behind, right? Right now, during a preview, kind of a differences is quite huge, if you ask me, because the latest Microsoft Graph PowerShell is 2.24, I think, when the Entra PowerShell latest is dependent on 2.15, right? So you see that there are kind of 9 releases in between, right? That's not kind of a following, if you ask me, right? So they need to kind of make that better, probably when they go with the GA release. Coverage of Graph PowerShell is like comprehensive across the whole graph. They are focused on completely Microsoft 365 services, including Entra. Entra PowerShell is focused only on Entra resources and nothing else. You could not use Entra PowerShell to manage SharePoint, Exchange, Teams, all the other services. It's only for Entra. And then we are coming to the probably biggest difference between those two. Graph PowerShell is auto-generated. Graph PowerShell is providing thousands of commands. And the reason why it's like that and why it's always current, because it's auto-generated. Those are the good things. The bad things with auto-generated commands are that they are not user-friendly. And that's one of the problems that admins have with Graph PowerShell, and Entra PowerShell should fix that, because Entra PowerShell commands are human authored, and not just commands, but also help files. With the Graph PowerShell, the help is also auto-generated. People complain a lot about low quality, lack of examples when we have just a single example, or we don't have any examples. Descriptions are kind of sparse, and you don't get the same quality as you are familiar with already with like other PowerShell modules, and the PowerShell experience is just not as great as we used to have with other things. Right? So Entra should kind of correct those things. Let's go with a demo now. So for demo, I will kind of later somehow, Heiko will tell me how you want to do it. I can share a code as well and slides. And I think that this collection of resource links is quite useful to have. Just yesterday, I had a conversation with one of the MVPs who asked me, like, do you know where I can find Microsoft Graph docs documentation on GitHub, right? Sometimes those links are not very well known. So here we have first thing that both Microsoft Graph PowerShell SDK and Microsoft Entra PowerShell are open source. Their home is a GitHub. This is where you go if you want to submit PR, if you want to submit an issue, if you want to open discussion with the teams. Entra PowerShell team is always following what's happening there. They are reacting on every single bug report. They're participating in discussions. So the best way to get in contact with the team is a GitHub repo. Okay. How you get both of the modules, and practically 4 of them, because they support the stable v1.0 endpoint and also beta one, you get them from a PowerShell gallery. Those are the links directly to a PowerShell gallery, but you can also practically to install them, you will fetch them with an install module or install PS resource. And if we look, for example, on this one, let's just see how frequently they are releasing stuff. You can see that the latest one is 0.17, released 2 weeks ago, and they have like a bunch of releases, sometimes even 3 times in a month. Okay, so those things are changing frequently. Okay. Documentation is available on a Microsoft Learn part of a site, but also on a GitHub. They have repos for both documentations for Entra and for Graph PowerShell, and as you know, they are accepting their issues and the PRs there. So if you find some problems, you can help them to fix them, and you can also just go there to kind of sometimes just realize how frequent the updates are and what they are doing there, how they're changing stuff. For installing Entra PowerShell, you need to use allow pre-release parameter, because the release is still in preview. So you will see that the find module should find the 0.17 preview version, as I've shown you already on the site. And that's the one that I already have installed on my system. I usually install both the Entra and Entra Beta, one that is stable and one that targets the beta endpoint. Just be careful when you do that, that both modules are of the same version. Don't update just one of them and forget the other one, because then you will experience problems with the messages like assembly with the same name already loaded, kind of things. So those things need to be in sync. Okay. When you install it, what you will get is just a couple of modules. It's a couple of files. It's not a very complicated module by itself. It's not a binary module, which is a great thing. Everything in Entra is written in a pure PowerShell. So all commands are actually functions, and you can see the code of every single one of them. And if certain things don't work as you would expected, you can actually see where the problem is and actually pinpoint to the exact line that causes an issue and things. So just to show you the dependencies, if we look at the module manifest file for a module, PSD1 file for Microsoft Graph Entra, and when we get to the required modules list, you will see that this version 0.17 depends on Microsoft Graph Entra related modules of version 2.15. Okay. The thing here that right now I see kind of people usually complain about this because they don't realize that if they install Entra with this version and then they install the regular Microsoft Graph, which is now 2.24, then they will have a problem if they first run connect MG graph to connect to a graph, and then the module with the version 2.24 is loaded, and then when they want to run Entra will find that the assembly with the same name is already loaded, but not with the version that it expects, and then the command will fail. And people are kind of having issue with that. One of the safest ways to kind of work with Entra, especially at this point, is to run it in a container. And that's something that I'm doing for quite some time now, because I wanted to avoid to have just a single VM just for Entra and nothing else. So I'm using container, and I'm installing in that container Entra and some of the other modules that are not related to Microsoft Graph. The Entra installation installs the dependency that are needed, and then I connect to that container from Visual Studio Code. Other way to run it is to, if you don't want to run it locally, you can actually create all that environment in GitHub code spaces, and then from Visual Studio Code, connect to code spaces and run it there. The environment that we will use here is just the Azure VM that I dedicated to Entra development and kind of following all the changes with the Entra, and kind of deliberately sometimes installing different versions to see how they match or mismatch and how to work with these things. But if you want to be kind of safe in that environment, the best possible way, I think, is to run those things in a container.
Aleksandar?
Yes.
Would you be okay to take questions now if something?
Absolutely.
Because
absolutely. I'm just not following the chat, but
yeah.
you can stop me wherever you want and read me a question, or
I can just ask the question. Can you hear me?
Or you can ask me the question.
Yes.
Hey,
Sure.
do you have a reference on how you set up your container? Do you have a Docker file? What did you use to set that up, or good references? Because I've seen a bunch of stuff all over, but I always like to see somebody who's gotten it successful and go from there.
So I will tell you how I did it, and I think that's possibly the laziest possible way. I went to official PowerShell documentation, and in that documentation there is a document that will tell you how to set up a container for contributing to official PowerShell documentation. And I reuse that Docker file and that dev container JSON file to build my own container. And after that, I will just add Entra module, and that's it. So nothing special. I practically borrowed everything from PowerShell theme, thinking that they would know what they're doing. And they are suggesting people to use that definition of a container for contributing to documentation, as I'm already doing that part, I think like, okay, let me just add one more module there and it will work for me. If you cannot find it in a PowerShell documentation, I will post the link later in a meetup after a session so that you will get it there. Okay.
Cool. And we can also include it into the description on the video on YouTube.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Cool.
So I practically just reuse the work of PowerShell team. So I will not run these two commands here. I just wanted to show you the number of commands that they are covering right now with Entra and Entra Beta. And you can see the number is 242 and 289 for the current release. The reason why I'm not running this is that at this moment, they still have a performance issue, and these commands need a little bit more time that I would like to use during a demo to show you the number. The problem with performance is known to a team. A solution is also known to a team, but we are just waiting for them to implement a solution. The problem right now is caused by the fact that when you are running a first Entra command, or you're running something like this, when they need to go through all the Entra modules, they are also for importing the Entra, they're importing all the Microsoft Graph module that Entra is depend on. And that asks for time, right? So what they need to do, they actually need to follow what Microsoft Graph module is doing and what Azure PowerShell module is doing, and separate those Entra commands in sub modules, and then have one umbrella module that will actually load the other stuff when they are needed. But if you want to run something targeting Entra users, then you will just need a module for authentication and module for working with users. You will not load groups and applications and directory and other modules as well, right? Because that slows down the things. They're aware of that, and they need to fix that before GA. Okay. Here with this output, I'm just showing you what are the commands that are supporting a user resource in Entra. And you have the main one for working with user. You will see that here at the beginning. But then you have all the others that are working with relationships and those navigational properties from other resources. And the support already is quite good, but we will see more and more. And I think that we will at certain time kind of reach the 100% parity between Graph and Entra PowerShell commands for doing stuff with things. What you need to realize is that the syntax for Graph commands and syntax for Entra commands right now are not the same. And also there might be different names, but different names or different verbs that they're using can be actually fixed pretty easily, right? With aliases. And I think that we will see that very, very soon. So for example, when you work with users in a Graph PowerShell, they have update mg user. When you work with the Entra, then they use a different verb. They use set, right? So it would make sense to introduce the alias update Entra user as well, so that people don't need to guess, right? I don't expect that those changes will be part of the Graph PowerShell development, but they should be part of the Entra PowerShell development. The reason why it's set here is because the verb set was used in Azure AD. And as I told you, in a short term, the main goal for Entra team was to introduce the easiest possible way for users that are still on Azure AD to move to Entra PowerShell to work with something that targets Microsoft Graph API and not the Azure AD APIs, because those APIs will be retired in March. Okay, so a couple of every time when you see actually those mismatches with the names of commands and parameters, the reason is that they wanted actually to make them in sync with Azure AD. But as I told you, it's kind of not a big problem. Once when they introduce aliases for those things, things will work nice with the Microsoft Graph users as well. Syntax is also different. As you can see here, this is a syntax for Microsoft Graph command to work with the users. And they support more parameters than the Entra. Entra supports just a couple of those that actually exist in Azure AD command for working with users. So they, for example, recently introduced alias, not alias, now user ID is now the real name of parameter. The alias is object ID, similar to the name of parameter in Azure AD module. And they're supporting a little bit of things with the page sizes, a filter, but only for simple queries, not for advanced, and also a way to specify the properties that you want. If you look at the graph one, things are a little bit extended more with things. First, we have support for advanced properties with consistency level and count variable. You have a page size, top and all. You have a sort, which we don't have here. You have headers so that you can specify directly headers that will be passed to the underlying REST API call. And those things are kind of more advanced right now in a graph, but they are coming to Entra as well. Okay. When we think about authentication, for branding reasons, Entra team introduced Connect Entra command. And they will tell you that Connect Entra is a wrapper for Connect MG Graph. Unfortunately, it's not exactly a wrapper in a way that I would like to have, because when you create a real wrapper for command in PowerShell, you should use a proxy functions. And with just a couple of lines of code, you can generate a code that behaves exactly the same as an origin, and then you can add or remove certain parameters and certain functionality there, but they didn't do that. They practically did this, and you can see that during my demo, I'm using this a couple of times when I'm getting command in Entra, and then I'm just taking the script block property of it, and then I pipe that to code and dash to open it in code instead of showing it in a terminal. This is kind of a nice hack that I like to do because it's just easier to scroll through these things in the editor than in a terminal. And as you can see here, they are manually practically creating all these parameter sets and all the parameters, and then they're kind of checking for calls for every single property parameter here, and then at the end they are passing the specified parameters to Connect MG Graph. Okay, this is just too complex, I think, and error prone, so they should use easier way to do it, and actually kind of do it this way. Just with these 3 lines of code, they create a perfect proxy function when everything that exists in origin exists in this one as well. The only things that you will change is practically a name. Because right now, for example, the bug exists in current code for Connect Entra when they didn't strongly typecast context scope parameter. It's just an object, so you don't get tab completion that will offer you current user and process as it works in Connect MG Graph. It's a small bug, nothing like kind of a stopping you of using things, but you know, like you can avoid those things if you just create proxy functions for wrappers, not just for this command, but anytime when you realize that the command that exists in Graph PowerShell is good, it actually works very nicely, and you want to replicate that functionality in Entra, just changing maybe a name and then a parameter or two. It's better that work with that with the proxy functions.
Alexander?
Yes.
There is a question regarding the aliases. It was
Okay.
how well are the Azure AD command aliases are working? Is there some experience? Will there be an alias for every Azure AD command?
It should be alias. So it's not that everything is supported, but whatever you need, you practically get with the one command. And the name of it is enable Azure AD aliases, I think. Let me just check. I think, okay, it should be enable Entra Azure AD alias. You run that command and then you get aliases, but not 100% coverage. They are telling us that kind of a 98% of capabilities of Azure AD is covered or will be covered with the stable version of Entra. We will see how that works. I'm mostly focused here in this session in comparisons between Graph PowerShell and Entra PowerShell, but I hope that the work that they are doing will also help people that are working with Azure AD as well. You can see here, for example, when they are working with parameters, this is just my command for giving you aliases and things that you can see here. Okay, I need to rerun helper functions. I didn't run that up front. Okay, and then we can go to this is here. If I run this, you can see here that they have object ID as alias for a user ID, so that when object ID is used with Azure AD, and it works here, right? And if they have some other parameters like that, they will have aliases for that as well. Another thing is that right now they don't have lots of aliases for commands. You can see just a couple of those here. I personally using only this one. This is because this is at first they created this one, and I complained that it's kind of a new thing that people expect to run something similar to get MG context, and then they created this one, and this one were now as alias for it. So that's the only one that I'm using, but they will probably, for usability purposes, sync the set verbs and update verbs and some of the others. For example, in Graph, they use member of as a relationship, and here in Entra, they're using membership, right? So for people coming from Graph, if they look for member of, they will not find it, right? So it makes sense to introduce that alias as well. One of the things that really bugged me at the beginning of using Graph PowerShell is how they are working with non-default properties. If you have a familiarity with Active Directory on premises in a AD domain there, you remember that it was not possible to get all the properties. If you wanted all, you needed to tell the command -property star, and you will get all, right? And here, it's even more important not to deliver through the wire over internet all the properties, but just a subset of them. and designers of Microsoft Graph API decided, for example, for a user resource to give you only 11 default properties. For everything else, you need to ask for, okay? And this is how the output looks like. Any questions?
No, not at the moment.
I'm hearing some voice. Okay. This is the default output for Graph and Entra. And as you can see, the default output is exactly the same. Okay. So let's see what's happening when I'm asking for a user type property, which was, by the way, part of the output of AzureAD, get AzureAD user, right? Because we want to know if the account is a member or a guest, right? If I ask for property user type, look in a graph, look what happens. You don't get anything. And then the question is like wait a minute, like what's happening here? I'm not getting anything, but if I pipe that to format list, you will see that I'm actually getting that, and I need to ask specifically with select object for the user type, but I'm only getting user type, I'm not getting anything else. They designed the dash property parameter in a way that when you say, I want this property, you only get that property. They remove default properties, which is just crazy design, if you ask me, really. No one expects that. This is really unheard of. I never heard anyone doing that thing. So practically, they are telling you that if you want some of those default ones, you need also to ask for them in the same way as you are asking for not default. Just when you ask for a single non-default parameter, everything else needs to be passed as a list of properties as well. So if I do this, then you can see I'm getting the default ones, but I'm again missing user type because they didn't design the default formatting properly. So the default formatting is not including a user type property. So I need to, again, pipe that to a format table and specify the exact list of everything that I want to see. Okay. If you ask me, too many problems, too complicated, very confusing to new users. And those things are now fixed in Entra. When you just ask for Entra user, you pipe it to a here. I have here somehow deleted user type. And I'm getting everything with just one command directly here. I don't need to repeat the list of properties on both sides of the pipeline things. So those are kind of simple things, but that's very great. Why does that even work that way? If you, and dash debug is like super helpful and very important parameter for working with the graph and also Entra, because it gives you access to everything that happens behind the scenes. And you can see the actual request that you are sending to Microsoft Graph API. So when we run get MG user, what's happening there is that we are sending this, we are targeting this users, and give me just the top one. I'm doing that just so that I don't need to scroll for a long time. But compare this output to Entra output. In Entra output, you will see the same results here, but look at the number of properties. And why it's like that? Because they are changing the request and they are extending it with this select statement here and a long list of all the properties. So instead of just 11, you will by default get all of this. That's probably not the best design when you think about the bandwidth that you will use this stuff. So I think that in a very near future, they will actually reuse the solution from Azure PowerShell team. Azure PowerShell team introduced parameter called append selected. So if you are interested in default ones and new non-default ones, you say dash append selected switch, and then you get all of them. If you're interested only in some specific properties, you then say dash property and the list of properties, and you will get only those and nothing else. Okay, so that's much more flexible, and it kind of goes very well with the initial idea to kind of not deliver everything that is there. Another example that it kind of gives you a interesting perspective on what's happening when you work with Graph is that one of the properties of a user is sign-in activity. And you will think that the sign-in activity is just is one of the properties of a user, like no different than any other, but it actually is. And the reason for it is that it comes from a different source. The sign-in activity info, it's coming from the audit log. So first thing is that you need to extend the permissions. You need to add audit log read all permission. And because you need to do that, Entra team needed to remove it from a set of default properties that they are releasing at first, because they did that in one version, and then users complain that if they run it, they need to also have audit log read all, even when they are not interested in a sign-in activity. So Entra team redesigned stuff, removed sign-in activity, and now we know that if we want it, we need to explicitly specify audit log read all permission to get it. This is the experience when you want to get sign-in activity in Graph. First, you will think that you can use as a user ID a UPN as well as a ID, but it's easier to work with the UPNs. And when you run it like this, the command will fail and complain because the audit log doesn't want to work with anything else but GUIDs. So you need to specify a GUID. And if you do that, you will get results. So I'm getting now Diego Siciliani from my tenant specifying his ID. And now I'm asking for a sign-in activity because sign-in activity is not default property. So I want it as another. And what's happening is that I'm only getting the ID, and sign-in activity is in the output, but it's not visible by default. And that result right now is very confusing, right? So I need to pipe that to select object and expand the property for sign-in activity to actually get some information about sign-in activity. And this is what I'm getting. I'm getting the 4 properties that are part of the complex property called sign-in activity, but I don't have any information anymore about ID, about the UPN, about anything else, right? I'm just getting the sign-in activity stuff, which means that I need to extend with the display name and the username and the ID to have something that I can work with. So if I do that, display name doesn't exist, user principal doesn't exist. I have only the sign-in activities, the ID, and you can see that 2 more information are actually part of the additional properties. Those last successful sign-in date, time, and request ID. That tells me that I actually need, in my first command, to add all the properties that I'm interested in. It's not enough to add it here. In select object, I need to add it to a dash property as well. And if I do that, I will finally get the display name, user principal name, and ID, last non-interactive and sign blah, blah, or these 4, and then 2 of those will be in additional properties. With Connect, Entra, things are now simplified. simplified in a way that if I ask only for sign-in activity, I'm just not getting it, but I'm getting everything else. So I need to expand it. And then I will get all 6 sign-in activity related properties, not just 4, all 6, but I need to add display name and user principal name and the ID or any of those other default properties that I want as a value for dash property. So I will have select object dash property with those properties that I need, and then expand property for sign-in activity. So again, things are easier than with a graph, and I'm getting nicely everything here without need to kind of work with additional properties and kind of do some additional processing of things by myself. Okay. One of the things that really bothers Graph PowerShell users is the lack of support for pipeline, right? Pipeline is one of the fundamental PowerShell concepts, and it works really badly. Actually, it doesn't work with the Graph PowerShell almost at all. Sometimes you cannot even fix it. So, for example, if you have any PowerShell experience, you know that this is kind of a very common way to update a certain resource. You first run get resource, and then you pipe that to update resource or remove resource or any of those actions. And that's something that we expect to work without any additional changes. If you try to do that in Graph, you get the error. Pipeline has been stopped. It doesn't work. You get a hint that input object has a null value for input object group ID, which means that if I insert this hash table with a group ID key and the value of ID, the things will actually work, and I will kind of fix a pipeline with insertion of for each object command there. So now the display name, a description name for a group is updated. In Entra, things are how they should be from the start. You just get Entra group, and then you set the Entra group description, and no additional fuss. You get things working. If I would run now get, even in a Microsoft Graph this, you will see that new test group is the new description, right? So again, pipeline is one of the focus on in Entra PowerShell to fix that. Why does it work? If you look at the help, it's very clear why does it work. It works because they added support for a pipeline to the parameters. So if you go to a group ID, you see here, the group ID now supports a pipeline input by property name and by value. And this is a reason why things work. Another thing that it's really great here, if you look at the help of Entra, is that they put a lot of effort to make help better with extended examples. So we have here example 1, 2, and more of those. Let me just compare that with update MG group examples. If I run there, let me see, we can do it here. And you can see that we have only one example. With set Entra group, we now have 6 examples, okay? And the good thing is, and I really like this, that they are adding the short title to examples, so you can get information immediately what's there in a help file. Here for get Entra user, they put a lot of effort and practically giving you 14 different examples compared to, I think, 6 in Graph. Yeah, 6 in Graph. So a lot of effort is, lots of work is included and done with better help system, especially with the examples that are actually usable, examples that very often, and I think that's kind of mandatory now for almost all examples, gives you information about the required privileges as well. So the least privilege is always mentioned at the beginning of every example so that you know what is needed so that you can actually run this example and it will work in your environment. This is just brilliant. This is something that really, really was needed because the way how we work with permissions, with the Azure AD and Graph and Entra changed. And now we need to pay really attention to all the permissions, and very often people don't know how to start it, how to look at those things. So,
Alexander?
Yes.
There is another question
Sure.
from Alan. How does the Entra module cope with the consistency levels? With
the consistency level. Okay, I have that towards the end, but I can kind of cover that now. So this is something that they need to fix. They lack support for advanced queries at the moment. They don't support right now parameters needed to redirect call to indexed store of directory, and they don't have also headers, so you cannot even specify consistency level in as a value for headers parameter. So right now, a filter parameter in Entra works only with simple queries, not with advanced ones. So for example, if you want to get a list of disabled accounts, this kind of query will work. Account enabled is the property. When it's false, means that the account is disabled. And in Entra, that works, and you get Walt Disney. If you try that in Graph it works as well. The thing is that the operator equal works with the simple queries and doesn't ask for index store. It doesn't ask for advanced parameters, count variable, and consistency level. So the not equal ask for advanced one, and this one works in Graph. You will get the same result. It's just a different query, but you cannot mimic this and replicate this in Entra because Entra for now doesn't support that. Okay. I know that it's in a backlog of Entra team, so support for advanced queries is coming. I just don't know when. For now, only simple queries can be run.
Thank you. Cool.
Let me show you. Yeah, let me show you one thing. When Entra really shined, there is a bug for a long time now. I think more than 2 years in the API. When you work with a stable version of Graph API, and you ask for members of a group, the service principals are not returned. And official suggestion is use beta endpoint, which translated to PowerShell means use get mg beta group member, and then you will get service principals, or use a parameter that is not still supported in Entra, but it works in Graph, called expand. When you ask for a specific resource, and with expand, you ask for relationship, for extend, for navigational property. For navigational resource. So in this case, that will be command in PowerShell get mg user ID dash expand, and then you will ask for members. Mg group dash expand members, and then you will get members, and inside of those members you will have a service principal as well. Okay. So those are the workarounds that are kind of recommended for now, but Entra made it kind of easier and no problem for you because they are doing all the hard work behind the scenes. And let me show you how that exists in the Graph and the Entra at the moment. I'm using here the group ID to ask for members of a group that I know contains users, groups, and the service principals. Okay. So what I'm getting by default are just IDs. And just be aware that this is something that happens all the time in Graph PowerShell. Every time when you see only IDs, that means that you got back Microsoft Graph directory objects types. They always contain three properties: ID, that you can see, deleted datetime, which is always empty, unless things are deleted, but if they are deleted, you will not even get them there. And then all the other stuff are in additional properties property. Okay. So if I pipe this to format list, you see here that I'm having actually 3 users and 1 group, and all of them by type look the same: deleted item, deleted datetime property, ID property, additional properties. Okay. Then you look for OData type and you realize, okay, this one is user, and this one is user, this one is group, and this one is user. Where are my service principals? Because I know that I have 2 service principals in this group. So even to kind of expand this into a more usable way and get display name and OData type visible so that I don't need to look here for things, I need to expand additional properties. And then additional property is a generic dictionary, which is not that bad, but the thing is that generic dictionaries are also case sensitive. So I have example, I think a little bit later, when if you ask for a sub property of additional properties, you need to really pay attention to casing, because if you are not doing that properly, you will not get anything, right? And we don't expect that, because, you know, like it's advertised that 99% of things in PowerShell are not case sensitive. If they pick a hash table, we will not have a problem. They picked generic dictionaries, and now we have a problem. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually turning the values that are keys and values is additional properties. I'm converting them to a hash table, and then I'm converting them to a custom object so that I can actually work with the objects instead of generic things. And I can see actually what are the members of my group and what are the types of those members. And you can see here again nicely that we missed service principals. So how can we fix that? If we follow recommendation to use a beta endpoint, we will just change command from get mg group member to get mg beta group member. And we will see now the real list of members with these 2 service principals. They were kind of hiding from us. Or, and this is something that I don't explanation for it, why it works. I know that it works, but no one told me. I just kind of play with it and found this hack that works, that if I add additional advanced queries properties, parameters to this command, suddenly the request is redirected to that index directory store, and there I get service principal. And this is not documented anywhere. This is not part of the known issue entry in that site. No one kind of documented this at all, but it works. And this is just something that works for this thing that for that known bug that exists for a long time, is fixing problem, but it's not something that you can apply to some other stuff. And I really don't know why it even works, to be honest. I'm just knowing that what I'm causing with this 2 parameters, but why they fix the problem, for the same API when they told me that that API doesn't return service principals? I don't know. When we work with Entra, we don't need even to worry about it at all. First, we can use a piping first. So we can get nicely reference to a group, pipe that to get member, and then we will select that just to show you that with Entra, I'm getting everything. Users, group, service principal. I didn't have any devices, so I cannot show you that, but that was not part of a bug. And as you can see, Entra nicely fixed the problem so that you need to worry. How they fix it, if you look at the code behind get Entra group, you will see that they are actually asking for another API call to get just the service principals, and then they are combining all the outputs together. So that's something that it's kind of interesting how they are doing. So we are coming close to the official end of my session, but if you are interested, I can continue. I have 2 more examples, and if you think that they could be interesting, I can continue with the session.
I'm very sure they're interesting, so I think please, yeah,
okay.
Go ahead, Aleksandar.
So let's talk now about output objects. Output objects for direct commands. When I say direct, that means when you run get Entra user, get Entra group, what you get back is actually a user, a resource, is a group resource, is an application resource. And this is how it works in a Graph PowerShell as well. But when you work with relationships, when you work with get Entra user manager, or get Entra user direct report, or get Entra group member, what you are getting back are Microsoft Graph directory objects. And those Microsoft Graph directory objects are not the same in Entra as they are in Graph PowerShell. In Graph PowerShell, they always contain 3 properties: ID, deleted datetime, and additional properties. Practically, they're using that additional properties as a kind of a property bag when they put everything that it's not ID. In Entra, to make it more usable, they started creating new object that it's of a type Microsoft Graph Directory object, and then they are adding the node properties to it so that users can get better output. But the problem that I think we will have in the future with that is that you see the type, but you cannot guess what are the properties of that type. So if you work with members of a group, the output can be just users, or users and another group, or users group and service principal, or users group service principal and devices. They're all different, right? And they need to extend them differently because they have different properties. And I think that they need to fix that so that this is not auto-generated, they actually need to output the real resources. So if the resource is a user, you need to cast it as a user. If it's a group, you need to cast it as a user, not to extend directory object to it. Because in Graph, it made kind of a sense because all of those types are the same. They all have the same structure. Here, they don't have the same structure. And I think that they will be, in a long run, kind of a confusing, and there is a better way to do it. We'll just see if they will do that for GA version or maybe later, but I think the sooner the better, because it will be harder to fix it later because it will introduce a lot of breaking changes. So let me show you just now an example what are the experiences in a Graph and Entra when we need to work with the properties of things, and we need to kind of find usable output, not a default one. So for example, if I'm asking for get MG user manager, what I'm getting back is just the ID, okay? If I pipe this to get member, you will see that in getMember, this is some generic Microsoft Graph Directory object. Nothing tells you that this is a user back, right? Because manager can be a user, but can be also organizational contact, right? Right now, I don't have a clue if the user for Diego is actually a user or a contact, really, right? So I need to look at the properties, and then ID doesn't tell me that, deleted datetime doesn't as well, but additional properties has OData.type subproperty that will actually give me that information. So as you can see, we already kind of have a little bit of an issue here, although we have at least consistency that every time when we work with relationships, we always get a same type with the same 3 properties. And this is how it looks like when we pipe the format list. You can see here, right, that, for example, the manager is a user. For Diego, it's actually, I'm his manager. And when we look at just additional properties, this is what we get. We don't get a full list of properties for a user. We are getting just a subset. We are getting some, let me see how many, yeah, like 10 of properties that are part of directory objects, not a user, okay? And look at this. Now I'm using, asking for the subproperty user principal. You can see user principal is Aleksandar Nikolić on Microsoft.com, but if I run it like this, I don't get anything. Do you realize why? Anyone?
Yeah, it's a hash table. It's not a PowerShell object.
It is a dictionary, but it's not a hash table. It's a
okay.
generic dictionary, and it's case sensitive. So here you can see that it starts with lowercase u, and I ask here for the uppercase u, right? And I'm not getting anything. So can you imagine a problem when you have some if statement in your code and you are mixing the casing, and then you need to do something when user principal is this and you get empty and your script doesn't work. It's terrible, really. You need to pay attention to all of this. And here, luckily, we can know and realize that they're using the camel casing instead of the Pascal casing. So every first word starts with a lower one. But later, if we have a kind of a 3 or 4 words combined, we cannot guess all the time like how things are working. So just case sensitivity is always an issue, if you ask me. Let's repeat the command with in Entra. So in Entra by default, you get the same, only ID, right? The same as here with the graph, right? There is no difference, right? But then if you pipe it to a format list, look at this. It's much longer. You are getting assigned plans. You are getting attributes. You are getting your location. You are getting this thing as well, but like identities, things really. You get a lot of different things. Why you are getting all of that? Because Entra team extended the Microsoft Graph Directory object, adding all those node properties so that you can actually get something that it's usable, but at the same time, they will do it differently for a group, and you will have a different set of properties there, but the type will be the same. And I think that that might cause some problems in the future. If you don't want to work with additional properties, there is a really nice hack that you can use, and use a method that every single output in Microsoft Graph has called toJSON string. So look how this is how it looks like. We are now asking for MG user member of. We want to find all the groups or the administrative units that Diego is a part of, okay? And we will pass that to a variable called member of. with the parameter out variable. So by default, we are only getting 3 IDs. Maybe those are groups, maybe they are not. We don't have a clue. Groups or administrative units, one of those. If we pipe this to format list, this is what we get. We get 3 objects. Every single one of them is Microsoft Graph directory object and contains these 3 properties. Looking closely into a content of additional properties, we can see that we have 1 administrative unit and 2 groups. And they have some additional stuff. Every time when you see things in the output in braces, you know that you can expand it to get more. And when you have those ellipses, then you know that you have something that is not shown on the screen. So if I use to JSON string method, this is what I'm getting. I'm getting a JSON that contains all the properties, okay? Everything. This is for a group. This is for a group. At the beginning, we have it for administrative unit, just these 3. So to turn that back to a usable PowerShell object, I can pipe it to convert from JSON. If I do it like this, and this is kind of an interesting thing, that because the administrative unit is the first, and administrative unit has only these 3 properties, the groups are formatted in the same way. So this is what I get with the default formatting. The other group properties are also there, but they are just not shown on the screen. If I sort it differently so that the groups come first, then the output changes. And I'm getting the group with all the properties here, and then the administrative unit at the end with just 3, which is just kind of interesting thing. Nothing is lost. It's just kind of hidden in a default output. And this is how Entra is working with that. By the way, you can notice here that they change the noun. In Graph, it's a MG user member of. In Entra is Entra user membership, okay? Entra user membership, by default, outputs the same thing, only IDs, okay? But when we pipe that to a format list, we are immediately getting everything. And we are getting much more of those properties because, let me show you the code behind it. It's get Entra user. Code. Okay, something's wrong. Some typo. Entra
Ship.
user
Yeah.
ship.
Yeah.
Okay. So all that magic that helps you with the properties, it's happening towards the end when they are looping through the responses and adding the alias property for object ID, and then they are adding the things that are part of the content of additional properties. And then the reason why you get everything is that once when you pipe this to get member, you will actually, if you pipe this to get member, so I think that I picked the wrong one. Or they might already change something with this one. Yeah, they change something here. Let me pick another command that's maybe something from here with the user manager in Entra. Pipe this to get member. And the reason why you see lots of those properties is because they added all these node properties to the Microsoft Graph directory object type. So they create a new object type that it's like this, and then they add all of this node properties to them, and then you see something that is usable but I think still it will be better if they actually output the real objects. If it's a group, give me a group, right? Don't hide it between kind of a generic directory object, and then I need to cast it to get everything, in case that I want really everything that's maybe not output by default when we work with directory things. One of the great help with Entra is actual simplification of commands when they are doing the hard work for you. So for example, if you are working, if you want to update a manager for a user, you cannot do that updating a user, because manager is navigational properties of a user and it doesn't work like that. So update mg user will actually give you an error. What you need to do is you need to use a command that works with a reference to a manager. So get command mg user manager will output something like this. So you see that only get verb for mg user works directly with the user. Get, remove, and set work with the ref, by ref, which means that the way how you build command is a little bit more complicated. So first here, I'm having a reference to a manager, because I will need his ID later. And this is a user, Adele, that I will add myself as a manager to her. And now I need to create this hash table when the key is OData ID and the value is the URL that points to me, to a manager, using the ID there. So I'm creating a body that I will pass as a value to a parameter called body parameter. So set mg user manager by ref, user ID, and then reference to a manager. And things are now working. So if you look at it like this, you see that you are getting only the ID. That's my ID. If I pipe this to a format list, you can actually see that in additional properties, that's me. Okay. And there is also get mg user manager by ref, which I discovered recently, that gives a little bit new output with just OData context and OData ID. And the funny thing with this output is that this output in the data ID is using endpoint v2 that no one knows what it does, actually. I ask around and people are super surprised that it doesn't, that it even exists. So we need to investigate a little bit more about what is this v2 endpoint, by the way. And I will now remove the manager here with the debugging so that you can see here that I'm asked to do a delete methods on the user ID /manager /$ref. And by ref is doing the whole deleting process as well. Also, by ref doesn't exist anywhere in Entra commands. It's hidden from you. This is what they call behind the scenes. And to create, assign a new user, a new manager to a user with Entra, it's much easier. You just need to specify a user ID and the object ID of a manager in a ref object ID. And then you don't need to create a hash table. You don't need to pass the hash table to things. You just do this, and let me see if the manager is assigned. The same manager is assigned with this. So this is much easier because what's happening behind the scenes when you look at the code, they are creating a proper hash table and passing the hash table for you, so you don't need to worry about that. Another example of simplification when people are actually getting what they need much easier with the Graph PowerShell than with the Entra PowerShell than a Graph PowerShell is assigned plans, for example. So in Graph, if I get a reference to a user, and then look at a couple of properties, object ID, display name, and assigned plans, what I'm getting here, only display name. I'm not getting object ID because it doesn't exist. It should be just ID, I think. Let me just check that part. If I change it like this, I will get at least ID. That was my typo. Yes, ID. But assigned plans are not there. Why? Because assigned plans are not part of a default property set. Assigned plans property is not one of those 11. And I didn't ask for it specifically, so I'm not getting it. In Entra, if I repeat things to get the reference to Diego, and then ask for a object ID here, because object ID exists as an alias to help Azure AD users, I'm actually getting the object ID, display name, and assigned plans. Assigned plans are all here in a braces, which means that I can expand them to get the full list with all the details. And if I rerun this, I'm getting all the plans that are assigned to Diego with all the details, with the display name and the ID and everything that it's needed. So it's much easier for me to create a report and stuff instead of going deeper, explicitly asking for assigned plans and then dealing with the additional properties and blah, 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 and all this stuff. Okay. So that's all that I prepared for you. If there are any questions, I'm free to answer them.
Thank you, Aleksandar. That was amazing. Yeah, so if still additional questions, unmute yourself or put it into the chat. So I would say it really makes, it's really more user-friendly. So do you think that other teams will pick that idea up and come up with a module that simplifies the management for other parts of the Microsoft ecosystem?
Yeah. When you say different teams, you mean like Exchange and SharePoint?
Yes,
and
yeah, exactly.
I don't know, to be honest. I seriously don't know. I don't know. Are there any works? I know that the initial vision of Microsoft Graph PowerShell SDK was to be a foundation for PowerShell modules that the other product groups will build. And that SDK part in the name is not there without a reason.
Yeah.
Okay. They put that deliberately to give you a hint that the Microsoft Graph PowerShell SDK module is there to support development of other scenario-based commands. Okay. Entra team is the first team that started kind of working on it, but even them are kind of moving now more into direct API calls that are happening behind the scenes than calling the Microsoft Graph commands and fixing them behind the cover so that you are not aware of it, you know.
Oh, interesting.
Because they realized as well that if they are fully dependent on Microsoft Graph commands and they are investing a lot of time and effort to fix them, but then Microsoft Graph team fix them, or they will need to repeat the work.
Yeah. Okay. So they go to the source, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So what I'm seeing now, looking at the code, is that more and more commands are rewritten to use direct API calls as well, and then just deal with them differently than Graph PowerShell in a way that they will provide a usable output, that it's not auto-generated, but they will actually pay attention to that certain alias properties exist if it's needed. They will pay attention that default output is not just the ID, but you get more. and a couple of other things, right? So they will extend the output they are getting from the API so that that output is actually usable for users, right? But they will probably kind of create some commands that depend fully on Microsoft Graph commands as some kind of a wrappers when they are happy how those commands actually work. But for those that need a little bit more customization and tweaking, they will go with another route to actually run direct API calls and then kind of save some work in the future if the Microsoft Graph team fix certain things or introduce some breaking changes and stuff. Right.
Yeah.
So
okay,
that's kind of
that's
my guessing. We will see how things will work more clearly when they release a stable version.
Yeah.
Because up to that time, they still have time to kind of introduce a breaking changes, a little bit of a change in design and things. One of the things that I would like to happen is that right now, Entra PowerShell module is called Microsoft Graph Entra, right? And I think that's wrong because first, PowerShell is not part of Microsoft Graph, which that name applies. It's generated differently, it's developed and created differently, manually by developers, not auto-generated. And if they change the name to just Microsoft.entra, that will allow them as well to have Microsoft.entra.users, Microsoft.entra.groups, Microsoft.entra.applications, which means that you will not need anymore to load everything. So if you want to run, let's say, get Entra group, what you will need for that is Microsoft Graph Authentication, because they are reusing Connect MG Graph, right, with just different name. And then you will need Microsoft Graph group and Microsoft Entra group. You know, you will need just 3 instead of 10 or 11. So the loading will be much faster. And if you work in environments like Azure Functions or GitHub Action Runners or Azure DevOps Runners, all those tasks will be executed much faster because you will not need to import all the modules, just those that are actually needed for your script. If you work with the users and groups, why would you need module for working with applications? Doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just a waste of time. And for those environments when it's really important that the cold start is as fast as possible, it doesn't make any sense to load more than it's needed. It goes to Azure Automation as well. It goes to most of those fully automated scenarios with the CI/CDs when you just care about the execution. You care about performances. You don't want to wait for your system to get available to you after a minute for executing a first command, right?
Yeah.
So I think that redesign is needed, and it needs to happen as soon as possible because it will be very hard to fix that problem later. And performance is like super important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so I would say, ideally, this is kind of a proof of concept inside of Microsoft to see how this works and how it gets accepted by the market, let's see, and then maybe ideally others will pick up this idea. But this brings me to another question. So do you have any idea about the timeline for this to become GA, or is this?
I cannot share anything.
Too far away. Yeah, okay. Okay, it's all good.
It's not too far away, but it's kind of not on me to tell you.
It's all good. Okay.
Right? But
all right.
It will be not something that we need to wait for another year or something, because the retirement of AzureAD is in March.
The
So-
the clock is ticking, right? So
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's true. That's
yeah,
true.
yeah.
But hopefully we will see that soon.
Cool. All right. So there are no additional questions coming from the chat. I think people already clapped. They liked a lot what they saw, what you presented today. I think it gave a very good introduction into what this Entra module can do compared to Graph and how it simplifies things. So thanks a lot, Aleksandar.
You're welcome.
Thanks
I
a
hope
lot.
that I didn't overwhelm you with lots of things.
It was awesome. I really,
Yeah.
it was really, really helpful. So thanks a lot. Thanks for everyone for joining. We will, I guess, the recording will be available some around next week. So if you follow us on LinkedIn or on Twitter, you will get the info, or we will put it into the meetup chat as well. So you don't miss it to go back to see. And as you said, Aleksandar, if we can add either the link to the script that you showed or the link itself, we can always do that.
Yeah. We will find a way, and also I will add that link for how to build container.
Yeah, I think in the chat there were two suggestions already. I'm not and we're not sure if there was the right one, but you can always share the one that you use, and then we all will also put it into the description of the recording.
Okay.
Awesome. So again,
Yeah.
Aleksandar, thanks a lot. That was really, really cool, really helpful.
Thank you
Yeah,
for
but-
inviting me. And this is my first time presenting for this group. I hope it's not the last. So.
Well, you're always welcome to come back.
Definitely. Alexander, I've heard you talk about this topic a few different times in different countries, different places. And every time I hear something new, I learn something new. And I always love seeing you present this because you show a lot of really good use cases and you make it understandable. So thanks a lot for taking the time to present to our group. And definitely, we would love to have you back.
You know what's funny is that I'm learning every single day. That's the thing.
We all are.
Just working.
That's the way.
Just
That's
working
the way.
on this session, I learned something new, really. And you know what's even more funny that I think that some people inside of Microsoft is learning together with me because I'm asking questions all the time when things are kind of confusing to me, or I don't like some things, then I comment on those. So I think that we are all together in this, which is just fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so I think it will stop the recording now. So again, thanks everyone. Thanks, Aleksandar. This was really awesome. Keep on scripting. See you next time.
See you.
So
See you.